There's the light. Now I can read. Good evening, everyone. My name is Melanie Yazzie. I'm an assistant professor in the departments of Native American Studies and American Studies at the University of New Mexico. I also recently stepped down as the national chair of the Red Nation, a grassroots organization I co-founded in 2014 that agitates for indigenous liberation in North America and beyond. I had held that position kind of as de facto chair for the 4 years prior to my election last year. I say de facto because it wasn't until last year that the Red Nation had grown large enough to adopt a formal structure of internal governance. On August 10th, 2018, our members convened for our first ever General Assembly to debate and adopt our also first ever Principles of Unity, a document that now serves as the living governing principles for our organization. As part of that General Assembly, we democratically created and elected leadership for the first time in the organization's history. Despite my protestations, my comrades elected me as the first chair of the Red Nation last year, a position that I'm pleased to say is now in the capable hands of my comrade and Shadeja Cheyenne Antonio, a Dene woman of small stature but powerful will, who will, I'm sure, usher the Red Nation into its next chapter of anti-imperialist solidarity and internationalism. That's right. I guess I did an okay job as chair because my Red Nation comrades elected me as the 2019-2020 Culture Desk at our third General Assembly on September 6th of this year. Something else happened at that General Assembly. We adopted revolutionary socialism as the organization's primary political ideology. Yes, a bunch of resi-red proletariat Indians are socialists. This is a big deal. And this is my first public appearance as an out socialist, representing an out socialist organization. That the Red Nation is a socialist organization matters when it comes to the term culture, right? I'm Culture Desk, and its meaning within our work for Indigenous liberation. To be Culture Desk doesn't mean I am now in charge of smudging or Indigenous spiritual protocol for the organization, which are important, but I'm not competent enough to do that. Like many revolutionary organizations prior to it, the Red Nation draws from long traditions of socialist political organization to guide its internal process and interactions with other forces in the fields of political struggle in which we participate. And like other organizations, culture, for us, simply means persuasion. And this is sometimes what people mean when they use the word propaganda, which I'm about to talk about. Before I realized I was a socialist, the word propaganda always made me wince. As a child growing up in the United States of the 1980s and 1990s, I remember the word propaganda being weaponized in US media to describe the trickery and duplicity of Soviet media. Later in my life and education, I came to understand these US proclamations about propaganda as actually just anti-communist, and culture in the US as not always but often, simply anti-communist propaganda. In other words, culture does not exist outside of the realm of the political, as some would want us to believe. There's been an interesting, somewhat disturbing, resurgence of interest in communism and the Soviet Union in the US media today, most of which is told through the fuzzy lens of what Russia means for Americans today. From the recent Emmy-winning HBO miniseries Chernobyl, to the recent blockbuster film Red Sparrow, headlined by Academy Award-winning actress Jennifer Lawrence, to the imminent threat that Russia, I keep using square quotes around Russia because it's like this idea of Russia that I'm not entirely sure people understand materially. So it's to the imminent threat that Russia poses to our sacrosanct electoral institutions, as well as our values of freedom and security. It is clear that Russia is a specter that continues to haunt America. Well, I've been thinking about this, and I don't think it's actually Russia that's the specter. I think it's communism. Or in the parlance of contemporary US-based political discussion, the socialist alternative that is gaining popularity as a response to the crumbling neoliberal order. Red Scare propaganda still sells, even 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it doesn't just sell, it is rewarded with celebration and the highest order of commendation. So to serve as Culture Desk for a revolutionary socialist organization based in the so-called United States is, to say the least, a challenge. I start my introductory remarks about Dr. Prashad, I'm going to call him Vijay if that's okay, with these reflections because I think it's important to mark exactly why I jumped at the chance to serve as his interlocutor this evening. First and foremost, I acknowledge Vijay as my comrade. Although I am a mere Padawan to his Jedi master in the long history of socialist traditions of struggle throughout the world, I look to Vijay as a comrade who inspires me, and indeed everyone in the Red Nation, a comrade who keeps us on our toes to sharpen our analysis so that we may direct our intellectual praxis to the building of effective revolutionary struggle, which really just means alleviating the suffering that the majority of our relations, both human and other than human, experience as our daily condition of existence under capitalism. As the Red Nation's new culture desk, I look to Vijay as an example of a principled comrade who wields written and visual narrative in a way that does exactly this, with wit and brilliance, surely, but also with genuine compassion and optimism. It is, in fact, from Vijay's writing that I learned that optimism, the insistence on imagining and organizing alternatives into existence, is a distinguishing feature of socialist intellectual and cultural production. It is from Vijay, and possibly Lenin too, that I learned our vocation as revolutionaries is also to be permanent persuaders, to produce narratives that persuade the wretched and humble people of the earth to rise up and reclaim our place in history. I could have introduced Vijay through listing his many achievements as an academic, which are many and definitely worthy of note. However, this type of introduction does not to me seem appropriate. Vijay, like myself, may occupy a certain petty bourgeois class position, right, as an intellectual because of academic pedigree or guild training in the academy. But I see him as a comrade because he is an intellectual force who produces knowledge towards the end of struggle and, dare I say, towards the ends of revolution. Whereas the academic typically works to uphold her own class interests, the socialist intellectual seeks to undermine the ruling class, instead aligning herself with the interests of the global dispossessed, laboring to produce narratives that instill confidence in her people and offer language to imagine and build alternatives to capitalism. While anti-intellectualism is often rife within lefty spaces in the United States, the key role of the socialist intellectual in building vibrant and successful mass movements cannot be understated. We need and deserve more of these courageous and unflinching thinkers. Our planet and indeed our future depends upon it. Please join me in welcoming one such thinker and my comrade, Vijay Prashad.
Good evening, nice to be here with you. I want to start by saying I'm very grateful to the Lannan Foundation for letting me come to New Mexico. This is in many ways the first time I've been here. It's also something very special for me because one of my great friends, teachers, was a friend of the Lannan Foundation, and that's Eduardo Galeano. And I very much miss Eduardo because, he had a lyrical way of attacking a world that's gone crazy and at the same time allowing us to believe that we are capable of becoming human beings. Before he died, maybe a few years before he died, he said something so very significant, and I felt I wanted to start somewhere in the vicinity of what he said. He said, scientists erroneously believe that human beings are made of atoms. Now, just before I go ahead with what Eduardo said, I recognize that we're in very dangerous territory now. It's very, I think, dangerous to attack science. So please understand that our friend, Eduardo Galeano, was a shapeshifter. And this comment of his is not exactly as you might read it. So let me start again. He said, scientists erroneously believe that human beings are made of atoms. He said, they're wrong because human beings are actually made of stories. It's a very moving line for me because it tells you so much about the human predicament, the importance of stories to us. I spent all day today, an exhausting day, from dawn to now, in front of a microphone. The whole day was spent in that way, communicating with somebody or lots of people far away, not being able to see their faces. In fact, I can't even see your faces now. But really, the human predicament is trying to reach people. It's trying to see your face, trying to become human together. There was an 18th century poet from the region where I spent most of my life who said, "Aadmi tha, badi mushkil se insaan hua." Aadmi tha, badi mushkil se insaan hua. We were people With great difficulty, we became human. It's very hard to be a human being. My lecture tonight is dedicated to Eduardo Galeano, my friend, our friend, a shapeshifter. Those who are against fascism without being against capitalism are willing to eat the calf, but they are against the sight of blood. They are easily satisfied if the butcher washes his hands before weighing the meat. They are not against the property relations which engender barbarism. They are only against barbarism itself. Bertolt Brecht, 1935. Terrible is the mood of the planet. Two of the largest carbon sinks on the planet, the Amazon and Papua, are in dire threat from land speculators and miners. The land torn from those who live on it, forced to produce for profit, and then burning, aflame. There is anger in the forest, but also anger from the people who live in the forest. This is old anger. In 1971, the Papuan poet John Kasapiwala wrote words that could only be written in capital letters. Reluctant flame, open your volcano, take your pulse and your fuel. Burn, 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 burn. This is climate change on steroids. This is capitalist greed that sets aside the people of the land, converts complex ecosystems into parking lots of production. Whether they pour concrete or soya, you have already begun to burn, 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 burn. Part 1, Earth. Marcelo Rivera, an anti-mining activist from San Isidro, El Salvador, was murdered on 18 June 2009. His fingernails and his hair had been plucked out, his trachea broken, his thumb fixed inside his mouth, his body hogtied, then thrown into a well. He was a member of the FMLN, the Farabundi Marti National Liberation Front, which fought against the oligarchy and US imperialism so that the Salvadorian people might breathe. Marcelo opposed a mine in his hometown. This was a mine being built by a Canadian firm named Pacific Rim. Marcelo feared environmental destruction. He was killed for his fears and his actions. The earth is no longer the metabolism, the interchange between humans and nature, the complex dance that sustains life. No social system has been as ravenous as capitalism, as fiercely productive in the manufacture of commodities, and as destructive to humans and nature. Nothing is safe from the process of commodification, not the minerals and condensed carbon hidden inside the earth, nor the air itself, not even such abstract concepts as time and space. Our time is commodified. Leisure is a gift. Our space is commodities. Housing is not guaranteed. Anything that lives, that dies, that was never to be born can be transformed into a commodity, something to buy and sell, something to hasten the accumulation of capital by those who own property. Nothing is safe from them. There is a very high correlation between the lands that mining companies want and that loggers want, and the lands that are barely controlled by indigenous communities. This is the case from Chile to Guatemala, from Canada to Papua New Guinea. Canada's Cameco, the world's largest uranium company, will begin to mine in the lands of the Tijual community, an Aboriginal people in Western Australia. Protest upon protest has not awakened the Australian public, to the dangers posed to the Tijwal community, nor has this stopped the hand of the Australian government. They are determined to mine for profit. Vicky Abdallah, a Tijwal leader, tells us that the mine will ruin Mother Earth. Abdallah's comment is an echo of the Andean concept of Pachamama, Mother Earth, an idea that is so important to international indigenous movements from one end of the planet to the other. It is a direct echo of the Mother Earth Accord signed by First Nation chiefs in Canada with all concerned parties around the issue of the Trans-Canada pipeline. Canada plays an outsized role in this mayhem. This is despite the fact that one believes always that Canada is a better place. Now that we've seen pictures of Justin Trudeau, the obligatory blackface, you might have a different opinion, but nonetheless. Canada plays an outsized role in this mayhem. If you look closely at the data, as our researchers did at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, you will find that 60% of the world's mining companies are based in Canada, and that most of the scandals around indigenous lands are linked either to Canadian or Australian mining companies. Canada's long and negative history regarding the First Nations inside the Canadian territory has, over the course of the past several decades, spilled over into the American hemisphere and outwards. In our first briefing document called 10 Canadian Mining Companies, Financial Details and Violations, we document ten of the most important Canadian mining disasters. Collectively, we write, Canadian mining companies display a depraved indifference to human life. And this indifference is considered to be just a natural or necessary side effect to economic growth. Canada is not alone. Add to it, as I said, Australia, China, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and of course, the United States, all major mining powerhouses. But Canada, the old settler colony, is a league apart. Our briefing document opens with Barrick, one of Canada's largest and most influential mining companies. We detail Barrick's role in the rape, violence, and arson at the North Mara mine in Tanzania, at the Durban Rudeport deep mine in South Africa, and at the Porgera gold mine in Papua New Guinea. Porgera in Papua New Guinea is a little-known frontline in the fight to defend the human nature metabolism. The Akali Tange Association, set up by survivors of the mining companies and miners themselves, has been documenting routine violence, the chemical attacks on the population, the violence of the company guards, the destruction of their community. Makdian Robert Yapari, one of the leaders of the Akali Tange Association, told me, "We have tried to reach for assistance to air our grievances for everyone to know what a Canadian mining company, the Barrick Gold Corporation, does to the indigenous communities here in Porgera. But," he says, "their appeal falls on deaf ears." There is too much profit. Barrick Gold has total assets worth $23 billion, proven reserves of 63 million ounces of gold. Its founder, Peter Monk, called Venezuela's Hugo Chavez a dictator and an autocratic demagogue because Chavez, in line with Venezuelan law, tried to get his people a better deal from the foreign companies like Barrick, companies that mine for gold. To fight for a better deal in the eyes of people like Peter Monk is terrorism, is dictatorship. When Montezuma sent his envoys to Cortez with gold, they returned with this report. Their bodies fatten on the gold and they hunger violently for it. They crave gold like hungry swine. In fact, worse than what Montezuma heard. Since companies like Barrick seem to crave gold like a Mexican rattlesnake, who hasn't eaten a rodent in weeks. We have turned our faces away from a series of criminal acts, tragedies for the people multiplying as the indifference of capitalism runs roughshod over their hopes. Decades ago, John Beta, a poet from Papua New Guinea, wrote Song of an Old Woman on Bougainville. Weep, weep, let us weep. Weep, weep, let us weep. We thought it was merely a stone. We thought it was merely a stone, but it carried away all our wealth. Part 2, waste. Capitalism is an illogical system that produces an enormous number of commodities. Firms compete against one another to make profits by the production of low-cost commodities which are then sold to consumers. But there is an internal flaw in the system. The lower the cost of production, especially labor costs, the less likely the product can find a consumer, since the consumer is a worker whose lowered compensation is what produced the cheapened goods. To cover the gap between low wages and high demand for goods, the capitalists offer credit. This credit is absorbed by the workers who, as consumers, buy necessary goods that they likely cannot afford. Then it gets worse. Ordinary people carry trillions of dollars of debt on their shoulders, money that hangs over them like a shroud. Debt is ugly. Debt sucks up the purchasing power of consumers who have to service debt rather than buy goods. Economies contract, tax revenues shrink, governments divert funds that should go to public expenditure to keep bondholders serviced. Everything smells like a crisis. Not only is the crisis of capitalism permanent, but it is fueled by enormous volumes of waste. There are 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic waste that form a noose around the planet. Of them, 150 million tons are thrown into the ocean. Most, 78% of the plastic waste from the United States goes to countries that burn it. Waste poses a serious problem. A World Bank report estimates that humans produce over 2 billion metric tons of trash per year. By 2050, that figure will rise by 70% to 3.4 billion metric tons. Of this trash, only 13.5% is recycled, while only 5.5% is composted. Thus, 81% of this trash is discarded in landfills or incinerated or thrown into the ocean. If we continue at our current pace of producing trash, we will need new planets as landfills. We will need new planets of trees and new planets of landfills. It is not precise to say that humans produce trash. Certain humans produce more trash than others. Now, you know where this is going. Certain humans, cue the American audience, the United States, with 5% of the world's population. I mean, this is an extraordinary statistic. If you don't remember anything else of what I say today, and I admit it's pretty depressing. The talk is called Despair and Hope. There'll be a lot more despair than hope until Melanie comes back on the stage. This statistic is something I'd like you to remember. The United States, with 5% of the world's population, produces 40% of the world's garbage. 40% of the world's garbage. In 1991, the World Bank's Larry Summers, a very familiar character, US Treasury Secretary, Harvard President, and so on. In 1991, Larry Summers was the World Bank's chief economist. He wrote a memorandum which made the following elegant point. The West has a surplus of money and a surplus of trash, while the poorer nations have a deficit of money and a deficit of trash. Why not, therefore, allow the poorer nations to be paid to take American trash? The scale of garbage production geometrically higher than it was in pre-capitalist times, has resulted in the commodification of trash. Major global businesses are formed to dispose of the trash, including through the export of this trash from one part of the world, the West, particularly the United States, to other parts of the world, the poorer nations. Summer's memorandum came at a time when the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America had started to ban the import of trash. In 1988, the Organization of African Unity called for a ban which came into effect in 1991 with the Bamako Convention. 69 countries of Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific had already banned waste imports with the Lomé Convention of 1989. It was to this tide against the trade in trash that Summers responded with his racist and deeply anxious memorandum. You mine the earth, create a big hole in it, and then want to fill that hole with trash. The chain of production, consumption, and waste starts and ends in the same place, the same land of the oppressed, whose land is important for its minerals and for its whole, for whose lives are not relevant otherwise to capitalism. The United Nations Environmental Program, set up in 1972, has as part of its mandate the surveillance of transboundary traffic in garbage. Multinational corporations that trade in chemical and waste have hampered its work. Greenpeace took up the issue of the garbage trade with vigor in the 1980s, forcing it onto the agenda, which resulted in the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movement of hazardous wastes and their disposal. This treaty was adopted in 1992. In 1994, at the second conference of parties to the Basel Convention, the G77 states, the Third World Bloc, were joined by the European Union to ban the trade of hazardous waste from the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which comprises the West and Japan, to non-OECD countries. Australia, Canada, and the United States lobbied hard against this ban. In January 2018, China banned all imports of garbage. Between Frederick Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England, 1844, and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, there's been widespread awareness of the toxic side of capitalist development. But workers and peasants didn't need Engels or Carson's analysis to explain the nasty effluents from factories or the terrible violence of chemical pesticides and fertilizers. The garbage that rots on the surface of the earth is the appearance of the problem. The essence of the problem is the requirements of our socio-economic system to endlessly sell commodities, then decrease their lifespan so that more commodities are bought to replace them, and so that the discarded commodity joins its brethren in the mountains of trash on land and the islands of trash in the oceans. In 1955, the Journal of Retailing noted that the system required that things be consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever-increasing pace. We need to have people eat, drink, dress, ride, live with ever more complicated and therefore more expensive consumption. This is what Vance Packard, in The Waste Makers of 1960, called planned obsolescence. We make good products, Packard wrote. We induce people to buy them, and then next year we deliberately introduce something that will make those products old-fashioned, outdated, obsolete. iPhone 11. If you go to the website of the Tricontinental, we have a new report on the rate of exploitation of iPhone workers. I very much recommend you go and have a look. We found that iPhone workers of the 21st century are 25 times more exploited than 19th century English textile workers. I very much recommend you go and have a look at this. Garbage, from the standpoint of capitalism, is an externality. Capitalist firms plunder nature for resources and dump waste back into the earth. The costs of this plunder and this waste are not factored into the balance sheets of the firms. These are considered to be external costs. The velocity of the production of commodities as part of the necessity for endless accumulation of profit generates theories such as planned obsolescence, setting in motion the creation of trash. In the West, computers used to last for 7 years, phones for 5. Now, computers are replaced every 2 years, phones every 22 months. Procedures to diminish the volume of trash by reuse and by recycling are minimal. Social life encrusted with commodification and consumerism cannot be easily pivoted to new forms. Prognosis for less growth when there is tremendous waste is low. There is, meanwhile, already pressure on spaces of deprivation that are receiving rather than producing the majority of the world's waste to not produce trash. This is like the debate over climate mitigation. The poor are being told to tighten their belts while the rich continue to spew carbon into the atmosphere. The 1987 UN World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission, defined the concept sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Certainly now, and from overuse, the term sustainable development has the tincture of meaninglessness. But when it was coined, it did mean something. It meant that development pathways should be conceptualized that allow the deprived to access more than basic needs, while the privileged should lessen their footprint on the planet. That meaning, contrary to the logic of capitalism, returns to our debates. Part 3, society. In the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher would often use the phrase, "there is no alternative," which was then refashioned as TINA. She meant that there was no alternative to the policy slate we now call neoliberalism. Thatcher also said, less descriptively and more as a threat, there is no such thing as society. The policies that Thatcher and Ronald Reagan pushed have crushed society. Life for the vast majority of people around the world continues to deteriorate. Commute times to work have increased, precariousness around jobs remains steady, wages are stagnant, and state benefits have declined to perilous levels. The institutions of social life have been damaged, sometimes beyond repair, with time to spend with each other much declined. There was something called society. The policy of neoliberalism has broken it. For 40 years, governments of various political tendencies followed the policy framework known as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism's core achievement was the destruction of the institutions of society. The first tenet of neoliberalism was to undermine institutions that regulate capitalist firms and to allow the bourgeoisie to sequester vast sums of wealth away from taxation and into their personal accounts. This led to widening inequality and to a drought for the budgets of governments. The bourgeoisie has, in essence, been on a tax strike for these past several years. They have hidden at least $32 trillion in tax havens. That's an amount almost 5 times the total value of all gold ever mined. To raise money to cover the government budgets, the ruling class had 2 options: to print and borrow money, deficit financing, or to sell government assets, privatization. Balanced budget amendments and IMF policy forced governments of a variety of political orientations to not do deficit financing and thereby tie one hand behind their backs. The other hand that remained, privatization, drove the neoliberal policy. Governments sold public assets at fire sale prices and commodified areas of social life, education, water, and so on that had previously been socially controlled. Neoliberalism not only increased the class control of governments by the bourgeoisie, but it brutalized society and drove increasing numbers of people to despair. Lack of investment towards social production resulted in underemployment and unemployment, and a lack of income for households resulted in enormous quantities of debt. This debt and despair shaped the social world of the planet. The complicity of the main political parties in the establishment of this social desert left them without any credibility. It is not enough to continue neoliberal policies and hold out entrepreneurship and skill retraining as a panacea for distress. The utter collapse of the social democratic and liberal agenda toward distress, alongside the general weakness of the left, opened space for the most wretched political forces to appear. These are the neo-fascists, from Donald Trump at one end to Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro at the other. But these neo-fascists are not mirror images of the old fascists. The context for their emergence is different. Their political character and project is not identical. The old fascists went after the strength of the left and the weakness of minority populations. Those were their targets. National racial glorification was their means. The neo-fascists have a more amorphous problem. The collapse of social democracy has left large numbers of people in different stages of despair. Social institutions, including the family, have been worn to the bone, with immense pressure on women to absorb the decline of social welfare through the older familial and social institutions of care. Community organizations, often bolstered by state and municipal funds, are now a shadow of their previous incarnation, while worker and peasant organizations, such as unions, are not able to drive the kind of cultural dynamic that was once so key to the communities of the workers. Gangs and militia groups, as well as various piety movements from Pentecostalism to Tablighi Jamaat, define the terms of social interaction. Pentecostalism is, of course, what you see in the West. In India, you see groups like Radha Swami Satsang. These are taking over the spaces of workers and the peasantry. Piousness is offered as the antidote to social collapse. The piety groups and the gangs provide modest social services and psychosocial services, food distribution, education and healthcare, as well as community gatherings around religious services. There is food distributed, but also quite heavy doses of patriarchy and homophobia. The father stands in for authority, a cliched hierarchy that mimics the strongman of society. Piety movements and the gangs have in many places substituted for society. While the left was fighting a rearguard action to defend social institutions against the cannibalism of neoliberal policy, the piety movements built their own religious schools, their religious hospitals, and their religious evenings to lift the spirits, and the gangs tightened their grip on working-class neighborhoods through patron-client relations over the illegal economy and through the delivery of services into these areas. It is on this terrain that the neo-fascists developed their attitude towards social disorder. Harsh policing is one spear of the neo-fascists, who deepen the already well-developed policing methodologies of the neoliberals. But the other sphere is the one that is most deadly. It is the attitude of the neo-fascists toward the socially vulnerable, those who despair without hope of an alternative. The panacea of privatization and job training in a fast-paced economy is not credible. Most people are overworked and underpaid, precariously employed, and socially exhausted. Majorities of people sit at the edge of social and economic bankruptcy. It is here that they meet the neo-fascists, who repackage the old ideas of social toxicity into new phrases. The word immigrant, for instance, taking the place of Jew. Socially vulnerable populations are blamed for the collapse of society. Migrants, gays and lesbians, women, religious minorities. It is the migrant who is blamed for job loss, and it is the gays and lesbians who are blamed for the malignant social order. Anyone weak is to be blamed for the immense damage done to society by neoliberal policy. The general thesis of the neo-fascist is this: blame someone who does not control the world, for even if you can't improve your life, you can feel bigger and better than them. This process was enshrined in the words of Thatcher: there is no alternative. Things are not so far now. During the aftermath of the credit crisis of 2007-2008, when it appeared as if faith in capitalism would erode and alternatives would be taken seriously, Germany's Angela Merkel announced Alternativlos, a world without alternatives. Stay the course, head down, money must be protected, all else can be weathered. Burn, 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 burn. Send in the fire extinguishers, or better yet, bomb the forests, for the power of money must not be touched. Part 4, happiness. But there are alternatives. These can be found in the contradictions. For instance, the emergence of the women-led workers of the care economy who demand a better world, from the Anganwadi or childcare workers of India to the women workers in Chile. Part of the neoliberal project was to dismantle state support for healthcare, education, and elder care. The breakdown of these crucial support services has put the burden of the care economy largely on women. No invisible hand takes care of this in our families. It is the invisible heart, as UMass economist Nancy Folber put it, that often does the work. It is not the invisible hand, it is the invisible heart. If not for the economy of care, it is likely that our entire family structure would have been far more of a wreck. The unions of care workers have maintained militancy, as in the United States, the nurses, have maintained militancy in the otherwise dormant trade union culture. One of the great downsides of our current inflation of atrocities is the sense that nothing other than this nightmare is possible. Alternatives cannot be imagined. Mockery pushes aside thinking about a different future. When these are attempted, as they always are by resilient humans, those in power strive to snuff them out. It is better for the powerful and the propertied to see that no model of an alternative is allowed to flourish. It would call into question the claim that what governs the world now is eternal, that history has ended. What are the challenges before us to organize the people against the intractable system? Here are 5 challenges, although there are many more. Number 1, aspirations. Over the course of the past 5 decades, the capitalist media and the advertising industry have created a set of aspirations that have broken the culture of the working class and the peasantry, as well as the traditional cultural worlds of the poor. Young people now expect more from life, which is to the good, but these expectations are less social and more individual, with the individual hopes often attached to commodities of one kind or another. To be free is to buy. To buy is to be alive. That is the motto of the capitalist system. But those who cannot afford to buy and who go into debt for their aspirations are also constantly disappointed. It is this disappointment that the authoritarians and neo-fascists channel toward hatred. Can the left movement channel this disappointment into productive hope? Second, atomization. State cuts of social services, the increased privatization of social life, and the astronomical increase of interaction with the digital world has increased atomization of humans. Where people had previously exchanged ideas and goods, helped each other, and inspired each other, now there are less and less venues for such face-to-face society. The fragmentation of society and the exhaustion of people to find survival has made it harder for the left to bring people together to create social change. Television and social media now dominate the world of communication. These are venues that are owned by monopoly capitalist firms. The left has always relied upon institutions of society to be its transmitters. As these social linkages fragment, the left dissolves. Can the left movement help rebuild these institutions and processes, this society that is its basis? Number 3, outsider. The authoritarian sections and the neo-fascists point their finger at the outsider, the social minorities, migrants, refugees, and anyone who is socially powerless. It's against these people that the far right is able to build its strength. There can be no left resurgence without a firm and complete defense of the outsider, a total rejection of the fascistic ideas of hatred and biology that saturate society. It is harder to build a politics of love than to build a politics of hate. Can the left movement develop a politics of love that attracts masses of people? Number 4, confidence. Politics of the people is rooted in confidence. If the people do not feel confident in their activity to either reform or to change the system, then they will not be active. Waves of unrest often lead to increased confidence, but even here, the point of emphasis is not the last person to join the protest, but the first few people who built the network to build the process. Social decay leads to a lack of confidence to make political change, particularly when the aspirational society suggests that the only necessary change is for everyone to become a consumer. Can the left produce the sensibility that a future is possible and to engender confidence amongst people to fight to build that future? Finally, number 5, democracy without democracy. In societies where there is no democracy, this problem is not immediate. In such places, the immediate task is to win the fullest democracy. In those societies where democracy is the main form, the oligarchy and imperialism have used many methods to undermine democracy, to dominate society without suspending democracy. The methods used are sophisticated, including to delegitimize the institutions of the state, to disparage elections, to use money to corrupt the electoral process, to use social media and advertising to destroy opposition candidates, and to utilize the least democratic institutions in a democracy, such as an unelected judiciary, to erode the power of elected officials. Can the left defend the idea of democracy from this attrition without allowing democracy to come to mean merely elections and the electoral system? The challenges before us are many. We come to them with no illusions. Tell no lies, said Amilcar Cabral. Claim no easy victories. But we are resolute. If we do not struggle to build strong left movements, we deliver humanity into the arms of atomization and hate, into authoritarianism and neo-fascism. That is the direction in which we are going, toward hate and the destruction of the planet. Only the left is against this orientation. The left must rush to build an antidote to alienation, social healing, a way to heal our metabolism, our damaged psychosocial consciousness, our social order. What is the alternative to the piety movements? What is the cultural world we want to create? Our task is simple. Either we organize people and form a socialist world, or the planet itself will perish. Heal, 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 heal. Thank you very much.